going to be a long video. Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon and I like banned books. Now that we're in September, we are going to celebrate Banned Books Week, which takes place this year, September 22nd through the 28th. And Banned Books Week is an event that is supported by a bunch of organizations, including the American Library Association, American Booksellers for Free Expression, and many others. It was launched in 1982 in response to a sudden surge of challenges to books in libraries, bookstores, and schools. It highlights the free and open access to information. And September 28th will be Let Freedom Read Day. And Let Freedom Read Day encourages people to take action. You could call a decision maker and ask them to support the right to read, support an advocacy organization, check out, buy, or read a banned book, or volunteer at your local library. Throughout September, I'm hoping to have a couple videos on banned books. And today's video is to go over all of the banned books that I have in my collection. All right, let's move these out of the way so I can, all right. Okay. Hope y'all have a drink because this is going to be a long one. All right, so I have two sources that I'm using for this video. And the first one is 100 Banned Books, Censorship Histories of World Literature by Nicholas Karolides, Margaret Bald, and Dawn B. Sova. Now, there is actually a current edition of this book. This is the first edition, which was published in the 90s, and that's when I actually acquired this book. There is a third edition that was published in, I want to say 2022, and it's like 120 banned books. But I'm not purchasing that to do this video. So I'm just using titles that I located in here, which is the first edition. And this is basically censorship histories throughout the world. So this does tend to cover a lot of bannings and challenges throughout history, which would include before the 1990s. Now, from the 1990s to present day, I'm actually using sources from the American Library Association. So I have 3 lists here printed out, and it is the top 100 most frequently challenged books. And they have one from 1990 to 1999, 2000 to 2009, and then 2010 to 2019. Obviously, the current decade that we're in, they don't have a list for, but they do each year post the most challenged books. I think the most recent list up is the most challenged books of 2023, and we will probably cover that this month. But for purposes of this video, the books in my collection, I've pulled from the titles listed in this book and the American Library Association's top 100 frequently challenged books starting from 1990 to 2019. Now, there are different types of banning. In the past, at least here in the United States, you would have legal banning, and where local jurisdictions would legally ban certain books from either being sold, from being in libraries, from being disseminated, from being published, period. Massachusetts, where I am, is one of the greatest offenders of legal banning. If you've ever heard the term banned in Boston, well, that's because the Watch and Ward Society, which was pretty prolific from the 1860s, maybe 1870s, to I think the 1950s, and they did their best to make sure that nobody was able to read certain books. So Massachusetts is a pretty big offender for that. Then you have kind of self-censorship, and that this is generally related to parents questioning schools or trying to get things removed from libraries. It's not necessarily legal banning, but maybe the school or the library will self-censor, and just because they don't want to deal with the controversy, they remove the books. A lot of these books are self-censorship. Some of them were legally banned at some point. Now, when we go over the books, I'm not going to give a synopsis because we will be here all day. I think all of these except one are classics. There's only one that isn't. I can't recall which one. So most of you may already know the synopses of these books. I've also broken them into some categories. You have religious suppression, political suppression, sexual suppression, and social suppression. Now, social suppression is kind of like a broad category because it could include sexual, religious, and political, one or all of those items, but in general, it just is an all-encompassing offense to social mores of the time. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to have to look at my notes for most of this because I'm not going to be able to remember everything. So I do apologize. We're going to start with political. All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque. This was published in 1928 in Europe and then in 1929 in the US. It was banned in Germany for being slanderous to the ideals of home and fatherland, and it was also banned by other countries in Europe for being anti-war propaganda. As most of you know, this is about the First World War. This was banned in Boston in 1929 for obscenity, and that was because there is a scene in here where a married couple has sex, and apparently it offended the Watch and Ward Society of Boston. Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut. This was published in 1969. It was challenged for being anti-American, unpatriotic, for criticizing government actions, and for being an indictment of war. People complained about violence, profanity, obscenity, and ungodliness. This next one doesn't have a dust cover because I removed it many years ago, but this is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stow. And this was published in 1852 and caused controversy from the moment that it was published. Stow's intention was to write a book depicting slavery in such a way that would incite white people against it. And like I said, controversial from the moment it was published, which was 9 years before the start of the Civil War. This was banned in the South. It threatened not only the American institution of slavery, but others around the world, including Russia. So Russia banned it. It was also banned by the Pope because it was deemed blasphemous for undermining religious ideals. In later years, including currently, it is challenged for its stereotypical depiction of white people, Black people, and its racist language. 1984 by George Orwell. This was published in 1949, and it was challenged specifically during the Cold War as both the Soviet Union and 1984 threatened America's democratic ideals and making communism into a positive light. But of course, people also complained that there was too much obscenity and profanity. Sticking with George Orwell, we have Animal Farm. This was published in 1945 in England and 1946 in the US, and it was banned for its political theories and objecting to phrases such as masses will revolt. Nobody wants the masses to revolt, so it was banned. The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. Published in 1939. The biggest challenge was by Kern County, California, which at the time was the center of the agriculture region depicted in the book. They wanted it banned because it supposedly smeared the good names of the county, the state of California, and agriculture. Kern County's movement was large scale and involved the California Farm Bureau Federation, the Chamber of Commerce, the Canners League, and large landowners. And then other people were offended because of profanity, vulgarity, and obscenity. One parent in the 1990s actually counted how many times God's name was taken in vain, which was 129 times. Vulgar language was 264 times, and references to sex was 31 times. I actually haven't read this yet. I probably should have mentioned there are a lot of books here that I have not read yet. A good portion of them I have, but not all of them. Grapes of Wrath is one I have not read yet. And the last banned book that I have in the political stack is Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. I love this movie from the 60s. Not the most recent one with, I think, Keira Knightley. I don't know. I don't know how that woman manages to get into every adaptation of a great novel. I have absolutely no idea. Anyway, the 1960s movie I absolutely love, but I've never read this book. It was published in 1957 in Italy and 1958 in the US. And it was refused publishing in Russia due to it seeming to cast a doubt on the Bolshevik Revolution. Pasternak was actually expelled from the Soviet Union of Authors and deprived of his title as a Soviet author. And people in the US wanted to ban it because it was considered un-American. Next, we're moving to sexual suppression. And y'all know where I'm going with this. Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. Published in 1955 in France, 1958 in the US, and 1959 in England. This was considered pornographic and believed that every little girl was likely to be seduced as a result of its publication. It was immediately banned in France and England and the US. US Customs allowed people to bring it into the country in 1957, but it still couldn't be legally exported from France. So people could smuggle it into the country, but no publishing house in the country was allowed to officially publish it. It was also banned in Argentina in 1959 and in New Zealand in 1960 and South Africa in 1974. This is a very, very controversial book. I actually have not read it because it's one of those books that I just don't know if I can bring myself to do it. I just don't know. But I have it, and I think one day I will try it. Jude the Obscure by Thomas Hardy. This was published in 1895 and caused so much controversy when it was published that Hardy actually never wrote another novel. He just lost heart. In this book, we have depictions of sex, premarital and extramarital, along with children born out of wedlock and women who didn't fit the ideal Victorian image. I'm not sure that there are many challenges these days to Jude the Obscure, but there were many, especially during the Victorian period. I have read this book and it's tough. It's a tough one. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. This was published in 1928 in Italy and 1959 in the US. It was banned in the US in 1929, and the post office barred it from the mail. I mean, I don't know how they know that you were actually mailing the book itself. I don't know. But newspapers were not allowed to mail advertisements, and so it was banned from the post office. People coming from Europe risked having their copies confiscated by customs. There is explicit sexual description and language, and there were various censored editions circulated for many years, but it was not published in full in the United States until 1959, causing a major lawsuit by the post office against the publisher. They did not want to allow the book in the mail. In 1960, England also published the full version, also having a bunch of obscenity lawsuits. Sticking with our boy D.H. Lawrence, we've got Women in Love. Again, I removed the dust jacket many years ago, which I'm regretting, but oh well. Published in 1920, so before Lady Chatterley's Lover. And this was challenged due to the homoerotic relationship of the two male characters in this. In 1923, a Supreme Court Justice, John Ford, tried to suppress this after his daughter brought it home from the library. I guess this guy Ford founded the Clean Books League, and he also favored strengthening obscenity laws. Now, I have to read this to you. D.H. Lawrence actually sent Ford a telegram, and it's brilliant. I have to read it to you. Let Judge John Ford confine his judgments to courts of law and not try to perch in seats that are too high for him. Also let him take away the circulating library tickets from Miss Ford, lest worse befall her. She evidently needs an account at a candy shop, because, of course, Women in Love wasn't written for the Ford family. Father and mother and daughter should all leave the tree of knowledge alone. The judge won't succeed in chopping it down with his horrified hatchet. Many better men have tried and failed. Isn't that fabulous? Gotta love that guy. Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. This was published in 1857 in France and then in 1888 in England. And here you have depictions of extramarital sex by a woman. France's government took action before the novel was even published, so they tried to prevent publication because I think there were portions of it that were published in some sort of journal or newspaper or something. So the government tried to even prevent the full publication, but they lost. After publication in England, the publisher was brought to court for publishing pornography. He lost, was fined, and told not to publish the work anymore. Sanctuary by William Faulkner, published in 1931, contains rape, prostitution, and vulgar language. There was a 1949 case in Pennsylvania that tried to declare this book obscene, but they lost due to the judge saying that his definition of obscene was to titillate, and this book did not titillate. There were renewed challenges in the 1950s after Faulkner won the Nobel Prize, and it was also banned in Ireland in 1954. Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded by Samuel Richardson. This was published in 1740, and it was banned by the Roman Catholic Church because it suggested a romantic relationship instead of being a morality tale as suggested by Richardson. I find it funny that they made no mention of the sexual assault by an aggressive man against a young girl in this book. They were only upset by the fact that there was some sort of suggestions of a consensual romantic relationship, not the fact that, she was being sexually assaulted. Moll Flanders by Daniel Defoe. This was published in 1722, and it was very, very popular at the time, and really nobody had an issue with it until like 100 years later, when you get into essentially the Victorian era. So people in the 1700s really didn't have a problem with it. It wasn't until the Victorians came around and their ridiculous notions of sex and family that people started having issues. So in the 1890s, the Victorians found it obscene that a woman used sex to her own advantage. The US Customs would seize copies of this until about 1930. God forbid a woman should be sexually independent. I know, shocking, absolutely shocking. How dare she? The Group by Mary McCarthy, published in 1963. And again, we have a bunch of sexually independent women. How awful. That sounds horrible. Banned in Ireland and New Zealand due to sexual situations, promiscuity, and suggestions of homosexuality. An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser. This was published in 1925, banned in Massachusetts for violating obscenity laws. There isn't any explicit sex in here, but it is clear that there is unmarried sexual activity, along with a reference or two to abortion. The public outcry in Massachusetts when this was banned motivated Massachusetts to modify its censorship laws. So yay for that. Take that, Watch and Ward Society. Forever Amber by Kathleen Winsor. This was published in 1944, and the main character, Amber, uses her sexuality to get ahead in the 1600s in the court of Charles II. She has several lovers. She bears 3 children with different fathers. So basically, that's why people deemed this as obscene, a woman using her sexuality. This was banned by the US Post Office. We got the Post Office again until 1957. It didn't really affect sales because mail distribution at that time wasn't an important part of book sales. And now we're back to Massachusetts. So Massachusetts got a hold of it, and it went to the highest court in the state, but the Attorney General who brought the case actually lost. The judge stated that the novel was historically accurate for the purpose of representing a time period with morals and customs different from our own. So take that, again, Watch and Ward Society. Awakening by Kate Chopin, published in 1899, and caused controversy from the moment it was published due to its representation of female sexual identity and independence. Are we seeing a theme here? I think we're seeing a theme. Apparently nobody seems to like sexually independent women. If I remember correctly, Chopin never wrote another novel. I could be making that up. Let me know if you know. I can't remember. I have read this, but it's been a really long time, so it's due for a reread. This next book was actually on all 3 American Library Association lists, so it's been continually challenged from 1990 until 2019, and that would be I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. And this was published in 1969, and it was challenged due to the depiction of sexual abuse of a child, rape, and an instance of teen pregnancy. This last book in the sexual suppression section was in every source that I had. So not only was it referenced in the 100 banned books, and it was also referenced in every single list from the American Library Association. So it's been challenged from day one. And that is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And this was published in 1970, and it was challenged due to graphic depictions of rape and sexual activity. And this was, and probably still is, often removed from reading school lists due to complaints from parents. I have read this. It is an amazing book. Toni Morrison is an amazing writer, but this is actually due for a reread. I have not read it for a very long time. We're now moving into social suppression. The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was published in the 1850s, and when it was published, the main complaint was that Hawthorne appeared to side with Hester and condemned her husband's marriage. Nobody seemed to care that Hester was being treated horribly. They were just mad that she was being treated sympathetically by Hawthorne. This was also banned in Russia in the 1850s. I believe the Tsar at the time had pretty strict censorship laws. There were no further complaints about this book for about 100 years. When parents wanted it removed from school readings and libraries in the 1960s and 70s, due to the fact it discussed fornication and adultery. The parents lost. Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. This was published in 1953, and it's an indictment of censorship. So ironically, this was censored by the publisher without Bradbury's knowledge, removing words like hell and damn, and describing drunk men as sick, and someone cleaning fluff out of his ears as just cleaning his ears. So odd. In the early 1990s, a school issued copies with various words blacked out, and due to the outcry that a book about censorship was being censored, the school officials reversed their decision. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, published in 1961, involved many court cases where it was removed from school teachings and also from libraries. People objected to the way it was anti-war, along with its language and references to women as whores. The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini. This was published in 2003, and it was challenged for offensive language, sexually explicit material, and fears that it would inspire terrorism. A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, published in 1962, and this has been controversial from the moment of publication and has been consistently removed from school curriculums due to its language, brutality, and sexual violence. I mean, I can't say that I entirely disagree. Do I think this book should be banned from libraries and from being sold and whatnot? But do I think this should be on reading lists? I don't know. This is one of those books where I'm just like, oh God, what's the literary value of this? Anyway, different topic. I might actually have a separate video on that where I discuss books that I have a hard time picking up because I just can't understand why they're still in the literary canon. Why are these disturbing books still being taught in schools? So, different video. One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest by Ken Kesey, published in 1962, and often challenged in schools for being racist, obscene, immoral, and for its emphasis on defiance of authority. Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. This was published in 1855. It was declared obscene and immoral from the moment of publication. In fact, this is one of the first books that the Boston Watch and Word Society censored. The Watch and Word Society was started, like I said, in the 1860s or 70s, and this was published in 1855, and so they got their grubby little hands on it and demanded that it be removed from bookshelves. Libraries refused to buy it, thus censoring the book by their refusal to buy it. Whitman even lost his job because of this book. So the Boston Watch and Ward Society, they ruined this guy's life by having it censored and removed from bookshelves, removed from libraries. It was also informally banned in New York and Philadelphia bookstores in the 1970s, and like I said, legally banned in Massachusetts in the 1880s. Native Son by Richard Wright, published in 1940, challenged for violence, sexual content, and profanity. The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, published in 1963, and this was challenged because its characters lived a objectionable lifestyle, including openly rejecting traditional marriage and motherhood. Oh gosh, how horrible is that? In 1977, a school board in Indiana removed this book and several others from the curriculum, which kickstarted a lawsuit by a student and her parents saying that the school violated the First and 14th Amendment rights of a student's right to know. The ACLU became involved, but the court case was dismissed, and upon appeal, the courts sided with the school. The Bell Jar is actually something I'm picking up in September because it is my September pick for the Massachusetts Center for the Book Challenge, and I believe the prompt was read the first book by a Massachusetts resident. Sylvia Plath, even though lived in England at the time the Bell Jar was published, she was originally from Massachusetts, and though she had published poetry, she had never published any books. So I'm pretty sure this counts. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer by Mark Twain. This was published in 1876, and we're going to talk about Huck Finn in just a minute. But similar to Huck Finn, this caused controversy from the beginning due to racism, immorality, and also it was considered pro-communist. American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, published in 1991. You have graphic violence, misogyny, and sex. Australia and New Zealand actually state that this can only be sold to 18 and above and possibly shrink wrapped. So there is a law in place in Australia, in New Zealand, that if you're under the age of 18, you cannot purchase this book, and I don't think you can actually get it out from the library. I treat this book similar to A Clockwork Orange. Like, why? Why is this still in the literary canon? And so you're possibly wondering, well, why, Shannon, do you have a copy of this book? Well, I only recently purchased it used, I might say for $1. I wasn't giving like any real money for this book because I am interested in reading some of these books to find out, do they really have any literary value? Why are they still in the canon? So, and this is one of them. Another Country by James Baldwin, published in 1962. We have depictions of interracial relationships and homosexuality. So those two items caused a big controversy. And it even had its own FBI file, separate from the file that the FBI had on James Baldwin. So I find that really interesting. Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. This was published in 1977, and it was challenged for racism and sexually explicit content. This next book was on all 3 American Library Association lists, so challenged from 1990 to 2019, and this is Toni Morrison again, For Beloved. This was published in 1987, and it was challenged due to violence and sexually explicit content. Again, this next book was on all 3 lists, and that is The Color Purple by Alice Walker, published in 1982, and it was challenged for its treatment of religion, for having aspects of homosexuality. There's violence, there's rape, there's incest, profanity, and sexual scenes. It was banned from all Texas state prisons for explicit language and graphic depictions of violence. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. Again, this is listed on all 3 American Library Association lists, so challenged from 1990 to 2019. Published in 1985, challenged for sexual content, anti-Christian themes, and homosexuality. The rest of these books that I'm going over are on all of my sources. So they are referenced not only in the 100 banned books that I talked about, they are also listed on each American Library Association list. So basically they have been challenged from the beginning. The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. And this originally caused controversy due to its vulgar language and behavior. One library removed it because, and this is hilarious, Huck not only itched, but he scratched. And he said sweat when he should have said perspiration. Shocking. Funny enough, the early complaints of this book were not racism. 50 years went by, the novel became a classic, and it wasn't until the 1950s when the first challenges came due to racism, the racial stereotypes, and use of racial slurs, and such challenges do continue to this day. I actually have not read this, but I do plan on picking it up because I do want to read it in preparation of reading James by Percival Everett, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, published in 1937. And this is one of the most frequently banned books in schools, mainly due to profanity. And other complaints include morbid depressive themes and an anti-business attitude. I mean, that's a lot in this teeny tiny little book. Now, he must pack a lot in here. I've actually never read the novel, but I've read the play. The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger, published in 1951, and has been consistently challenged through today for its profanity, references to premarital sex, and the rebellious views of the protagonist. This book I read several years ago, and I just cannot understand why it caused so many issues. I'm just baffled. To me, this book is just a bratty teenager, but I guess, you know, in the 1950s, that was horrible. I don't know. Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. This was published in 1932, and it was challenged because it is depressing, fatalistic, negative, and encourages people to adopt a lifestyle of drugs and sex. And it reinforces feelings that they can do nothing to make an impact in the world. And this has been consistently challenged in schools from the time it was published to present day. Last, but certainly not least, To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. This was published in 1960, and even though it has been a staple of reading lists in schools, it gets challenged constantly, including these days, due to its language and depiction of race. Well, that wasn't so bad, was it? Hopefully you are still with me. And if you are, please drop a little book emoji in the comments. Let me know that you're still with me. Also, let me know if you have read any of these banned books, if you intend to read any of these banned books. And thank you so much for sticking with me. I just noticed that the most banned author in my collection is Toni Morrison. We've got The Bluest Eye, we have The Song of Solomon, and then we have Beloved. So that's 3 books by Toni Morrison in my collection that have been banned. So if you're looking for a banned book, you can't go wrong with Toni Morrison. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. Bye.